I'm the founder of Ladies Get Paid. We are an educational platform and community that it's all about helping women advance professionally, financially. We have an amazing Slack group. So if you're not part of it, it's free.
It's amazing.
75,000 women from all over the world are sharing advice and resources and jobs. So please join us there. I also want to thank Comcast, NBC, Universal. They are the reason that I can afford to give this for free. So thank you to them. Lastly, our host, Book Passage. They are providing the books. So if you want to purchase from them, you will get a signed copy, which is exciting. But also you'll be supporting an independent bookstore that is enormous. So highly recommend you go through them. Though if you can give an Amazon review to me afterwards, or to Soraya, actually I should say, and Soraya, that goes a long way. You do not have to have purchased it from Amazon in order to give that review. Structure of today, first 35 minutes, we're gonna have a conversation here with Soraya, and then I'll be doing a reading from Ladies Get Paid. I'm gonna read the introduction and happy to answer any and all questions. This will go for about an hour. So let me read Soraya's bio and then enough about me, and I will stop speaking. So Soraya Chemaly is the executive director of the Representation Project. An award-winning author and activist, she writes and speaks frequently on topics related to gender norms, inclusivity, social justice, free speech, sexualized violence, and technology. Okay, that was a long sentence, so that's a lot. The former director and co-founder of the Women's Media Center Speech Project, she has long been committed to expanding women's civic and political participation. She is also the author of Rage Becomes Her. This is one of the best titles I've heard. The Power of Women's Anger, which was recognized as a best book of 2018 by the Washington Post, Fast Company, Psychology Today, Autostraddle, and NPR. She, of course, has a longer bio than that, but figured we should probably get started with asking her some questions. So thanks for being here today with us, Soraya.
Thank you for having me, Claire. I'm so excited to do this. I love your whole community, and I'm excited that your book is finally out in the world.
We should have a separate conversation about how hard it all was. One thing, I'm gonna just quote an interview. A journalist said this about your book, and I would love for you to react to it. They said that Rage Becomes Her is a battle cry of a book. Drawing on all corners of contemporary life, from media to education and medicine, she takes the reader through a woman's life, from infancy to adulthood, highlighting the systemic ways female rage is suppressed, diverted, or minimized, and she provides scientific evidence to back up her ideas. Quote, "If life as a modern woman is maddening, then rage is a sanity restorer." Did you feel like your sanity was restored by writing this book?
I don't know if today especially was the best day to ask me that. I felt that my emotional state was clarified by writing this book, which is maybe a little different. Was my sanity restored? I'm gobsmacked every day. I don't think it's a matter of sanity. I'm just literally never, I don't know how you can both be not surprised and shocked so consistently every day.
Yeah.
That's how I felt writing the book.
Yes. Yeah. Do we want to define maybe what rage is, or also sort of what it is and what it isn't?
Sure. The name of the book is a play on the expression "death becomes her." It's a play on the idea that we should be becoming, that we should always be attractive. And it also refers to the ways that I describe in the book that our emotions, especially anger, become material in our bodies. The way it actually becomes the fabric of how we feel and how our bodies respond. Anger and rage, there's so many synonyms, there's so many variations of these emotions. In my mind, rage is the violent, sort of dysfunctional form of anger. If you haven't named it, if you haven't been able to process it, if you have no uptake, if no one's listening to you, if what you're saying is just, you're banging your head against a wall, often what's left is rage, because in fact, in our society, we value violence. We reward violent expression. And so rage is one of the outcomes of that, for better or worse.
Is it good to have rage? I mean, I guess with the hope that we don't even have it at all, or is the issue when we have it and we don't let it out?
I think it's both. I think that ideally you would never reach the point of rage because people would be listening to you. Because when you say, I have this need or I see this problem, your society would respond by caring. The reason I referred to today is because I've had 2 conversations today with long-time feminist thinkers and activists, and both of them in our conversations, our conversations came back over and over again to why people don't care. Why is it that you can talk about an injustice and you can talk, for example, as we will a lot today, about intersectional gender inequality, and people don't care? It's either that it's too overwhelming to them, or they have a psychological or cognitive reason to downplay it, to minimize it. And in the end, anger is really an expression of need, right? It's a warning. What's wrong in the world? What is threatening me or challenging me or hurting me? And that's what it's for. It's a really important signal emotion. But when we don't get a response to that emotion, even from ourselves, it builds up and it builds up and it builds up. It can become consuming and very destructive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in your book, I read, rather than telling women to let go of their rage, you tell us to hold on to it. So I think you've spoken like a bit to it, but if you want to go in a little bit more about what you meant.
Yeah, I mean, I think for the most part, really virtually anywhere you are in the world, girls are not socialized to think about their anger.
Mm-hmm.
They're not socialized to name their anger. They're not socialized to say words like, this is what I really need today. This is really what I want today. In fact, the opposite is true. Generally speaking, if you're a feminine person, and I include in that, children who are boys who are feminine and affect, you're really expected to put others first, to see yourself as functional to the people around you, to see yourself as a person who should be helpful and pleasing and pleasant, before your own needs, before putting yourself first. And we see that in childhood with the expectation that young girls use their nice voices. Girls are told to say please 3 or 4 times more often by adults. They are really disciplined for interrupting, for engaging in disruptive behavior, which, by the way, is also charismatic behavior, right? Telling jokes and being funny and even cursing. It's all very charismatic, and yet we hold girls to politeness norms so that they aren't encouraged or rewarded for engaging in any of that dominant. It's a very dominant way of speaking, right? All of that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. How do we start to undo it? I mean, I know in the book you say ungendering our emotions. So I'm 34. It's just it's like, am I holding this in, or am I actually taking up too much? I mean, it's just, I think maybe it'll be a lifelong journey for many,
Right.
or all of us, because of how deeply socialized we are to not be. So I don't know, if you're just coming to this conversation and you're like, this sounds like me, but I have no idea where to begin.
It's very hard. And I do think it's a lifelong issue. And I think that it very much depends on context, because it's valid everywhere in your relationships and engagement. So whether it's personal, interpersonal, political, whether you're dealing with a conflict at work, essentially all conflict that we encounter that involves this emotion is a form of a relationship, right? And the give and take that happens in a relationship. And so sometimes, for some people, I think the first step is simply being able to say out loud, I'm angry. If you'd asked me if I was angry in my 20s and 30s, I probably would have said no. Of course I'm not angry. I'm not an angry person. I never feel angry. I would say I'm tired, I'm stressed, I'm losing my mind, I'm exhausted, I'm more exhausted, I'm exhausted some more. That was mainly between the ages of 35 and 40. But I wouldn't have said I'm really angry, because in fact, so much that I had to be angry about felt overwhelming and systemic, right? Like even with my spouse, he's very much a feminist, very egalitarian. The fact is that the economic system we live in and the workplace that we're in rewards and reinforces certain behaviors in people that because they become economically rational, right? So in our case, we had 3 very young kids. I was working, he was working, but in fact, he would just always make more money than I would in the workplace, and that seemed to make sense. So he took on primary wage earning for a period, and I did the flexible work that so many women do. But that can be enraging for all the reasons we know, right? You become the default parent, but also the default carer more broadly. And we know for women today, particularly during COVID, that this is we're at a crisis point with these dynamics.
Mm-hmm. The only silver lining I can see right now is that it's become, what's already existed has become so blatantly obvious that you
So
can't
obvious.
it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So like, if I had to find any silver lining, and by silver I mean like very slightly bronzed lining, it would be that. I mean, for somebody who thinks they're not angry, right, but who describes themselves in all of the adjectives that you gave, are they just not connected to it? Should they be angry? I mean, given like what's going on, they should be angry. So
Well,
what
I mean, I think yeah. I mean, I think, I said the first thing is to admit that you're angry. That's really hard, right? Because the minute you admit you're angry, you have to do something about it.
Right.
I mean, that's the issue. You say I'm angry, and all of a sudden you realize I am not being cared for, I'm not being loved, I'm not being supported. What is making me so angry? How can I name this thing? And what meaning do I make from it? Because if you stop and you say, I'm really exhausted, and then you start thinking, why am I exhausted? And for most women in the US, for example, they're doing 2 to 6 hours more unpaid care work in their own households. And that is exhausting, but it's also enraging, right? It's unfair and it's tiring. And what are you supposed to do with that? Because in fact, we are the designated nurturers of society. We're not supposed to inflict stress on people. We're supposed to deflect that stress. We're supposed to reduce stress for everyone around us, coworkers, friends, children. And if that's our job, then by centering our own needs, we are failing as people to be good women, right? Like, that's a big deal. It's very conflicting to say, I have this need and I deserve reciprocity in my family life or in my workplace or in my political life. I mean, this entire system that we have where women are working disproportionately longer hours, more stressful hours for no pay, it's a gendered wealth transfer, right? We don't really talk about it that way, but that's what it is. We have time, and with our time, we transfer assets that enable other people to do other things and limit our ability to do those things. And in theory, we're rewarded psychologically for doing that. But in reality, in the book, I'm saying, are we really? Because women have higher levels of chronic pain, chronic stress, chronic fatigue, autoimmune disorders. I mean, the list is very, very long of things that are happening to women's bodies that we kind of dismiss with, oh, that's just women,
Yeah.
And it's women with their teen hormones and their fertile hormones and their not fertile hormones. It's just women,
You talk about anger management versus anger competence. Curious what that means.
We don't need more management of our anger. We are all managing our anger all the time super well. And I laugh because, in fact, I spent a lot of time looking at the way Google works and the way algorithms work. And when you Google anger management, basically you get a lot of like celebrity white guys in movies screaming at screens or breaking things or yelling at each other, right? And so our idea of anger management is very much calibrated to that powerful male destructive expression, the punching of the wall or the screaming at the other man or the breaking of the computer in so many of these images. That's not all that's going on, right? I mean, there's the anger management that goes into sublimating and deflecting and this materialization in our bodies. And that's very unhealthy management. It's not healthy when people are breaking things either, but again, I'd say that's rage. By the time you're talking about anger management, there's so many steps along the way that haven't happened, like thinking about what's happening, what information is coming with this emotion, how do I acknowledge the emotion, what do I do with the emotion, what can I ask of people, and what can I realistically expect? Because the hard part for so many, particularly women in heterosexual relationships, the hard part is learning that maybe the person who cares for you doesn't care as much as you thought, right? And that's really hard. that's a super hard thing to come to terms with. And in fact, one of the most kind of eye-opening studies that I found from a professor at Berkeley was that in more traditional relationships between men and women, when women express anger, they're worried they're going to be penalized when they have anger. So they express it in ways that are acceptable in women as sadness or fear, neither of which suggest demand or control or even the hope that things will change. Sadness and fear are very different than anger. And the studies also showed that they weren't wrong, because men in those relationships also think that when women get angry, that they're being selfish, that they have some moral failing. That doesn't build egalitarian relationships of reciprocity and care.
How do you, well, let me talk about the workplace, because I got a bunch of questions people
Mhm.
submitted. So I'll maybe stop asking my own for a minute. Any suggestions on how to assert myself as firm without being labeled as stubborn and harsh? But I'm going to ask another question that's a bit similar as well, so you can think about both of these. What suggestions do you have for how women can handle themselves in work situations where people are quick to accuse us of being aggressive and angry, when in reality, we are just trying to get our opinions heard?
Right. So this is hard. I'll also speak specifically to the fact of intersectionality,
Please do.
because we know how much this matters. What you just described there might be an experience that a white woman has in a room full of white men, or it's an experience that a Black woman has in a room full of white women,
Mhm.
right? And so I think we need to be cognizant of our own biases and stereotypes, and what might be operating in the room we're in or in the corporation we're in. So, you know, I mean, all of these things start in early childhood, but for Black girls, the assumption that they are angry and disruptive and belligerent begins from day one. They're much more likely to be disciplined in school, to be expelled from schools, and their simple assertiveness or just joy and glee and ways of expressing themselves that are seen in young boys as leadership potential end up being very harshly dealt with. And that goes through adulthood, right? I mean, we've seen it for years in our politics, in the way Black women politicians are portrayed and represented. And a lot of the work we do at the Representation Project is to address that kind of stereotype and that kind of representation in media. If you're a white woman and people think you're angry, or they want to silence you by saying you're angry, you're usually more likely to be described as crazy.
Mhm.
You know, there's the angry Black woman stereotype and the crazy white woman stereotype. And if you're dusky or ethnically ambiguous, like I am, you could be like Mediterranean, Arab, Hispanic. You know, you're fiery, you're hot, you're like some tasty, delectable thing. It's ridiculous, right? I mean, it's all the same. It's all a way to say, I'm not going to listen to your words. And that's very hard to respond to. And so in the workplace, I think it's very important to actually find allies, to find other people around you that you can talk to this about, and that you can actually strategize with, because it's very often the case that you're penalized for pointing all of this out, right? It is a genuine double bind. You lose if you try, you lose if you don't. And so we need people who are not just mentors, who will help us work on ourselves, but sponsors who will work with the institution and will stand up and say, let her finish what she's saying. You know, you've interrupted her, she has a very good point, etc. Another good technique is actually to write things down, which may be a little bit more work, but when you write things down, it changes the exchange dynamic. And it's often very helpful to say, you know, I've noticed this problem at work, and I think that, and it's work, and we're in a capitalist society, I think it's not good for the organization, right? What are we going to do to address this problem in the organization? We need creativity. We need more productivity. We need people to do X, Y, and Z. But I would say that there is no easy solution, because these stereotypes are very powerful. And so we need better public understanding, better awareness, more openness about how they operate to limit people. We also need internal accountability. We need organizations that commit to this. If you're in a place where nothing's ever going to change, it's probably easier to leave it. which people do not have the luxury to do, right? It's not like you can say, you know, I'm going to leave my job today and go get another one. And it's doubly difficult. I noticed that, I think Gabriella here said stereotypes thriving under a white male script. The fact is that that anger expressed by a white man in a like a corporate environment is seen as leadership.
Ah, yeah.
You know, studies recognize that. Studies understand how the double standard works. And that is very aggravating, you know, and it's very real. So I don't have an easy solution to that.
Right. How do you, okay, so knowing that there's this double bind, right, and you have to, it's this tightrope that you have to walk, right, where you're assertive, but knowing that might be perceived as aggressive. How do you do that in a way that's not contributing to the stereotype, which is not an easy response either? But you know, should we have any kind of guilt over trying to,
yeah, it's interesting. I think that everybody has to make a couple of decisions in the moment. We know that women are allowed to express anger if it confirms stereotypes about women that they're nurturing, right? So if we look politically, we know that women politicians and women citizens, when they coalesce around motherhood, they check that box off. So Mothers Against Drunk Driving, Mothers for Sane Gun Reform, you know, the Children's Defense Fund. If you go, I'm a mom, I know it, I had babies, I've got it, I'm letting you know, now let me say my piece, that is what happens. So women in corporate environments are respected as leaders, even if they're angry, if it's in the context of nurturance, right? So if their affect is more about care than about anger or demanding, even if they're angry, if it's framed in that way, they get a lot more done. They're very productive. But again, that ends up being a situation where you have to know that you are confirming that stereotype. You are doubling down on the very thing that hurts you. And that's why, honestly, like in my writing and my work, I talk all the time about why we need to separate those things, like why we really need to know that being female, feminine, a woman is not the same as being a mother or potential mother from cradle to grave. It's just not. They're just like that. That whole ideology is at the core of so much of this.
What about women being mean to other women? This is, I get a number of when women join Ladies Get Paid, they say that their worst bosses were women and not men. So yeah, if you want to talk to us about that, and then have you seen any differences generationally? Is this older women used to be meaner to each other at the workplace, or just make me feel better if you can?
I think a couple of things. I have seen some, I'm 55, 54. I sometimes lose and gain a year depending on the day. I'm 54 actually today, but I do actually think there are some differences. I think that, like, I can think about media. And so in the 1970s and 80s, there was literally maybe one woman who had a visible profile on a major network for a short amount of time, right? And she had to work very hard to get there. And in fact, to get there, she had to renounce femininity. She had to renounce feminine attributes. Like if you think of the clothing styles of the 80s, so much of it was about women dressing like men.
But wait,
right?
Isn't that bad, right? Aren't we supposed to be feminine? So how does, if we're kind of trying to,
No, I'm saying, I think that is an entire era, right? And I don't think that's true anymore. I think this is a development where, in fact, we have the leeway to be feminine and to renounce that, But fraternity is incredibly powerful. And even today, we still know that very often at the highest levels of an organization, there are very few women and even fewer women of color and Black women. And so you end up again being the one or two voices in a space. And that makes it very difficult. And so the trade-off is, do I want to stay in this space or be penalized for challenging the space? And very often it's women who shut the door behind them. They're like, I've got my seat. I'm just going to I'm going to do my thing and be as successful as possible. Because there are costs to not doing that. I do think, though, that this goes back to the idea of allyship. I mean, there are a lot of feminist, progressively minded men who want to improve the situation. And there are a lot of anti-feminist, much more conservative women who don't care. I mean, none of us is born oriented in this way. And that's true of men and women. And so I think we need to stop relying. I mean, it would be nice if we had built-in solidarity among all people who weren't men, but we don't, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a big difference. Fraternity, I would say, is built into all of our institutions and has its power in the intersections between institutions. So if you're in media and you're men in media, you probably have pretty close ties and enough critical mass to have influence in finance and to have influence in Hollywood and to have influence in tech. But we haven't reached that critical mass yet. And what we need is to build bridges, I would say, across sectors. We need to build it within our own sort of sectors and practices, but building networks. I mean, and that's why I, for example, love your Slack.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that is a community of people from every sector, you know, and they're sharing and they're building networks and they're being very supportive.
Yeah, that was my intention, because so many groups are industry specific, which is great for networking, but not necessarily for solidarity building.
I agree.
Yeah, and also we have 120 countries represented, so I thought it would be even more powerful to connect with somebody in, you know, Africa to Oklahoma and to realize they have way more in common.
Yeah.
And then we kind of joke, well, knowing that we're all suffering, is that depressing or does that make you feel better? Something that I got, you know, questions that were sent to me, and I have, you know, some of my own thoughts is, how do you make anger productive? How do you channel it? But before you do that, what I'm understanding from you is maybe take a moment and recognize it before you try to, you know, make it this positive thing.
Yeah.
But how do you do that?
I think, you know, what a lot of research has found that makes a super amount of sense is that the naming and the making meaning of the anger is probably the best and first thing you can do, right? If you're getting angry at something really superficial, very often, there's probably something else bothering you.
Mm-hmm.
And it requires a deep breath and stepping back and saying, why is this happening? Why am I so short-tempered? Because very often, if you're in a situation, for example, at work, let's say you've had a terrible interaction with another woman, she may be your boss, you can't punch up. So what do? You go home and you punch down, right? And it becomes a kind of domino of affect, of emotional need that puts you at less risk. But you don't want to do that. You don't want to get home and get angry at the people you love because you were unable to do it at work, right? And so thinking through, why am I responding this way? I'm a writer, and writing is one of the mechanisms of making meaning. It doesn't work for everybody, but it works for a lot of people. But writing things down or thinking through, let me think deeply. What is my pattern here? What am I not allowing myself to know about my life? This is a big issue, right? Because when you really start peeling back this emotion, there are just certain very difficult truths that sometimes you have to encounter. And what are those, and what do they demand? And then I think the thing is, there's no one right way to use this emotion or to have it make change. It may be that you decide you're going to make some art, or you're going to cook, or you're going to start a nonprofit in your community, or there are a million different things that people can do. The question is, what do you want to do? What do you want to do well to channel all of this energy? There's a lot of energy in these emotions.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit actually about the Representation Project? Because I know we only have a few more minutes with you.
I would love to.
Yeah. So what are you doing there? And also, always, how can folks here support you and get involved?
Yes. So I am the executive director of the Representation Project, and I have been since July. And Kama, who is here somewhere, I can see boxes and yes, she joined a scant 4 weeks after I did. She and I are tied at the hip. We've learned a lot. The Representation Project was started 10 years ago by Jennifer Siebel Newsom, who is currently first partner of California. She's a documentary filmmaker, and she made a very groundbreaking film in 2011 called Misrepresentation. And it was about the way media misrepresentations of women undermine our leadership, our safety, our ambitions, a lot about sexual objectification and misogyny. What does racialized misogyny look like in our media? And then 5 years later, she made the film founded the organization because of a very positive response with the idea that there's a model here for changing public attitudes and behavior. If you can shed light on an issue with a film, engage in related social activism, you can, as demonstrably we have, change attitudes and behaviors. She followed up that film with The Mask You Live In, which is about masculinity, toxicity and masculinity. And that was in 2015. And just this past October, we released the third film, The Great American Lie, which is about the mythologizing of the American dream. And it really looks at inequality and the variations in inequality. It's very timely right now. She goes into many different communities in the United States to really record people's lives, to see how inequality and poverty and the crisis we're in is affecting them. And I would say too that the first two films used a lens of gender to think about how it affects individuals. And the third film is really, how do we think about gender as a structural issue in our institutions? All of that whole model, we have now taken and really exploded through our youth media programs. So we're very dedicated to education and equity, and we have a youth media academy and a youth media lab. The academy brings students between 13 and 24 in to train them in filmmaking, but it's really at its core about social and emotional learning, leadership, civic participation, and critically participating in your society. And that's super exciting. And so we'll do that again this summer in person and in hybrid, and are working to expand that nationally in person. We currently serve students nationally, but after COVID, we want to try and go back to meeting them in person.
Uh-huh. Well, that's a lot. That's intense. And I'm really glad that your colleague here just put in a bunch of information for people to learn.
Thank you. Thank you, Kelly.
To get involved. Also, everybody here, throw in more questions if you have them on the chat. We're going to keep you here, a couple more minutes if that's okay with you. I want to give folks a chance to be able to ask anything that I haven't asked. In the work that you're doing with the Representation Project, anything surprise you at all? Or even in your own research, actually, just in the work that you've been doing, ideas that you had, but then you were kind of
changed. I will share one fact that constantly fascinates me. Very often people will say, but men are just more angry. And men are more angry because they have testosterone. And, we really want to believe that anger is masculine. And sadness is feminine. Like, boys are really hurt by this. When they're little, they're really actively penalized for showing any softness, any empathy, fear, sadness, the same sort of punishing of girls for being masculine. Boys really get it in spade, and actually more even so, because it's a denigration for them to be girl-like. Whereas for girls, it's still really a good idea for you to be more like boys, in most sort of tomboyish ways, the way we used to call it. But the thing that really surprised me was that, in fact, testosterone doesn't make people angry. But behaving in aggressive ways increases everyone's testosterone. So if you stage, which is the way these studies are done, one person firing another person in a denigrating way, the person doing the firing, if the person doing the firing is a woman, her testosterone levels increase tenfold.
Okay.
Just by exerting power and acting dominantly, physically. If the person doing the firing is a man, it goes up fourfold because his baseline is already more testosterone. But what I find really fascinating about that is the connection between that and how we physically socialize children. We tend to protect girls and cultivate a sense of physical insecurity and more weakness, and we don't allow them to express dominant if a girl sits down with her legs spread open and her arms spread out, everyone's like, oh my God, cross your legs and close the gates to hell. Like, just do that, right? And in fact, that reduces our testosterone. Whereas the behavior that we encourage in boys actually increases the production of testosterone, which I just find endlessly fascinating.
I do too, yeah. And for any parents on here or folks who are thinking about becoming parents, I mean, this is where maybe we need to get a child psychologist, but I'm sure you have tips. How do we make sure that we are not perpetuating these gender stereotypes in the way that we raise our kids?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard and it's exhausting
Mm-hmm.
because, first of all, they're the words we say, and then there's the behavior we engage in, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think a lot about what's going on in homes right now. Everyone is inside, and millions of women have left work to be the primary caretakers of their families, and children see that. And there's a lot of stress, there's a lot of exhaustion, there's a lot of anger, there's escalating domestic violence. And this is all happening before any words are being said at all, right, about emotions or about how people behave. And so one of the things I talk about in the book is this idea of emotional competence, which extends beyond anger, right? We never really have this meta approach to our own emotions. I don't know about anybody on the thread. I would love to hear if people ever got this. No one ever, I mean, and I have 3 children. I've never seen it in their education either. We never learn about our feelings or our brains or how our cognition works or what to do with all these feelings, you know? And being able to name them and give them meaning, whether they're sadness or anger, is the most basic part of that. You know, and everyone has the right to that. Like, boys especially need to be told that they will be safe and loved and not reviled, you know, in homophobic, misogynistic ways if they express their feelings. This is a major problem for us as a society. You know, we have enormously high rates of suicide in young boys and in men. The fastest growing rate of suicide is actually teenage girls, but they started off at a lower level. But you know, depression and suicide and the inability to express your feelings or feel cared for are significant factors in a lot of our social and public health problems.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. No, it's interesting. So much of the work, I mean, the work that I do is to help women, but really, if I wanted to ultimately help women, we would change the behavior of men and change the institution. So sometimes it's like, and we don't work with men to teach them to be allies. That's not where I want to be, you know? So it's, what's the next book? Are you going to write another one?
It's so hard. Yes, well, I was writing a book about care. Like, what does it mean to have a feminist economy of care? And it was pretty funny because my publisher was like, yeah, that's important, but now we have this, you know, we have this pandemic and it's traumatizing people. And I said, yeah, but you know, the problem with trauma is it's ultimately also about care, you know, how we think about caring for each other in a society. And in my own personal case, I lost my father during the pandemic and could not go home because I couldn't get into the country where he lives. And that kind of followed up on Hurricane Dorian, which I'm from the Bahamas, and it decimated entire communities. It sat on top of that island nation without moving for a week almost, and almost destroyed it. And so the book is sort of about those themes and how gendered they really are. Like, the notion of care is very, very gendered at every level, not just in our identities or our relationships, but in governance. You know, like, we had 4 years of extreme carelessness just now. And we're living with the toxic fascistic machismo of all of these men around the world.
Well, I'm really sorry to hear that is what has happened recently to you. What a fucked
Well,
up.
so many of us, I think so.
So
I didn't mean to take the conversation down that path, by the way.
No,
but
no.
You know, I think that everyone knows what these stresses are like at this time.
Just speaking personally, I mean, after you did all of the research that you did and you speak so cogently on all of this, do you find that your channeling of your own rage is different now?
Oh, absolutely. I think I started writing because I didn't know how angry I was. And then the writing helped me understand that. And then I wrote about anger. So, you know, it was a good solid 10 or 12 year process. And I wrote the book, frankly, because I would have loved to have had a book like this when I was 12. It's a lot of information for anybody 12 years old, but I really wanted to arm people, particularly girls and women, with this understanding that I was never given.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, why have I reached my mid 40s and never understood any of this? Never understood this about myself, my health, my relationships, my well-being, my society. And I am immersed in feminist thinking. I really am. I have been my whole life. And this just struck me, particularly in the 2016 election, the treatment of populist anger and the way that men like Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump could leverage it, while Hillary Clinton was routinely punished for showing the slightest chink in her armor. You know, they could pound podiums and get red in the face, and you know, everybody loved the fact that they were angry male leaders who were broad-shouldered. I mean, I remember them talking about Trump being broad-shouldered, which is just, I don't even know what to do with that at this stage. But, you know, for Hillary Clinton, she had to stay calm and professional looking, and then was called inauthentic. And we ended up with, you know, Gamergate turning into Pizzagate in the basement of like a local pizza place. I mean, you can't make it up.
This question, and apologies that we're going a little bit over for
No,
you,
no.
but with Q and with these, I mean, there were pictures of these women, not pictures, videos of these women part of the insurrection.
Yes.
Are they treated differently? I mean, I don't know if you can speak to like the Q community, or how does, I mean, they're extremely angry and violent. So are they held to a different standard? Like, what's going on there?
You know, it's interesting. I recently wrote a piece with my co-writer, Catherine Bunny, about risk and cognition. And there's a lot of excellent science. I won't, when I'm getting off, I'll paste it here. There's a lot of excellent science about risk assessment, emotions, and what's called identity protective cognition. If you encounter information that threatens you, that threatens your status, chances are you're going to downplay the risk, and you're going to fight tooth and nail to deny the truth of the information, right? Which is what we see in something like QAnon.
Yeah.
And so, for example, if your ideal of what America is, and if that's being challenged, right, by a call that we recognize our history, our violent history of colonizing, being settler colonialists, of slavery, that flies in the face of everything everyone's been told is American, you know, and that's a hard pill for people to swallow, especially when they have to consider being implicated in that violence through white supremacy. Mm-hmm. And for a lot of women, if one form of status is being threatened, their status as women, right? Trump really showed how unequal the sexes are in this country. If that's being threatened, one easy way to offset that is to leverage whiteness, mm-hmm. right? Because that's another form of status that you can bond over with your family. So if you can bond over white supremacy, then the threats you may feel as a woman feel reduced cognitively. That's just one small thing. It's not meant to excuse it. It's violent, it's white supremacist, but there's a lot of very interesting thinking about women's role, and women have always been at the forefront of these movements in this country. There's just no doubt about it. But again, I also think that we confuse men and women with masculinity and femininity, because in fact, there are a lot of women who have lots of masculine attributes, and we see them act in ways that are counter to what we think the way women should be acting. And there are men who have lots of feminine attributes, but you don't see them tearing down windows in Congress, and we don't really comment on those men, right? Because maybe they're home taking care of kids, and nobody's really that interested in men doing that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Ah, God. So now I've just opened up way more questions that I want to ask, but thank you for being here. Let's, you know, in the chat, how can we follow you? How can we support you? Also in the follow-up email that we send to everybody, everybody will get the recording, and we'll include information about you, the book, the Representation Project. Before we let you go and everybody else, I'm going to do a reading right after this, so I'd be honored if at least a few of you stayed. But tell us any last words of wisdoms or places that we can stay in touch with you.
Well, first of all, I would like to thank you so much for having me. I love everything that you're doing, and I hope everybody reads your book. And really and truly, I belong to a lot of Slacks, and I just think it's great. I really do. I'm not like a very active participant because I feel so thinly stretched that I'm transparent at this point, but I check it like every single day. I'm reading, I'm looking, and
Interesting.
it's a really wonderful community. And so I strongly urge people to join it. And I'm going to hang out here while you're reading and put some information here for you to share, but I would love to hear you. I'm going to mute and I'm going to actually turn off my camera.
Okay, well, thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight.
Fabulous. So I'm going to just read the introduction of how it all began with this book. And again, for those who stay and for those who go, I appreciate both of you. How it all began. Before Ladies Get Paid the book came Ladies Get Paid the organization. It was born from 3 pivotal moments in my life. The first happened at an advertising festival. Party after party, CEOs of major brands socialized and drank with those who wanted their business. It was mostly men. At the time, I worked for a professional platform that connected creatives with jobs, and I was there to find clients. The festival opened with an outdoor cocktail party. Whose wife are you? He was tall, probably around 60 years old, dressed in an expensive-looking white linen suit. It had been barely 5 minutes since I'd walked into the party. I gritted my teeth and stretched my lips into what I hoped was a smile. I'm here on business. This was going to be a long week. Around-the-clock networking is tiring, and it was. But what was even more exhausting was the invisible, though sometimes obvious, imbalance of power between genders. Men greatly outnumbered women, and their seniority dwarfed ours. I needed these men to send me their business, but so many saw me, and many of the other women there, not as valuable professional connections, but as people to party with. Repeatedly, I had to wrestle the conversation back to a place that was relevant to my work, or simply back to a place where I felt comfortable. It was draining, but I'd done this dance before. In fact, I'd been doing it my entire career. Something profound happened toward the end of the festival. Needing to pee and needing a break, I sought refuge in the women's restroom. It turned out I wasn't the only one. Crowded in there were women of all ages, huddled together, connecting and commiserating. They traded business cards and tips on who to avoid and who was actually serious about networking. These women had come to the festival to get shit done. It just happened to be getting done in the ladies' room. I spent some time there recharging, then took a deep breath and went back out into the fray. After the week was over, I slept for 2 days straight. I felt demoralized and a bit disgusted as I replayed each unsettling interaction over and over again. From Mr. Whose wife are you? To the guy who slurred, you're hot, when I pitched him a business idea. Then my disgust turned inward. What had I done to attract this kind of attention? Was my dress too short? Had I been too friendly? This was an all too familiar loop, a constant refrain throughout my entire and throughout my whole career, and maybe even my whole life. But for the first time, something short-circuited my self-doubt. For years, I'd struggled to be taken seriously as a successful, ambitious woman, questioning myself in the process. One memory stood out in particular. I was at dinner with a man a colleague had introduced me to, thinking we might partner on a project. Toward the end of the evening, he grabbed my hand and pulled me in to kiss him. I snatched my arm back. Excuse me, I said in disbelief. The man looked utterly confused. But you gave me your business card, he sputtered. Besides the fact that it was a troubling misinterpretation of signals, what stayed with me was the fact that I was being perceived as a potential sexual partner instead of a professional one, despite every indication that I was there to do business. And as a result, networking with this person, who otherwise could have been valuable for my work, was an opportunity I would not pursue. It also made me feel like shit. Something I didn't include in the book, which is why it's nice to have you all here, what I said after. So when he said, but you gave me your business card, I said to him, but we're in the same industry. I would have been a fool not to have given you my business card. That would have been a whole other chapter. So we're not going to go into after what happened, but I had a realization. How many other times had I missed opportunities, not because of a lack of ability or performance, but because I was a woman? How many hours had I wasted agonizing about how to maneuver among men like these in this world that they had created? I thought of all the energy I'd wasted seeking approval from the men around me. I couldn't continue like this. Something needed to change. I opened my laptop and I Googled 3 words: women, work, and inequality. What I learned shook me to my core. The majority of today's college graduates are women, yet less than 22% of us make it past middle management. The wage gap, which is usually referred to as being 78 to 80 cents to the man's dollar, is not the reality for everyone. Depending on your race and a myriad of other factors, it can be so much worse. Black women make between 63 and 68 cents on the dollar, while Hispanic women make a mere 55 cents on the dollar. I was shocked. I felt angry. And on top of that, I was ashamed for not knowing it was that bad. And that reeked of my privilege. I'd grown up being told I could do and be whatever I dreamed of, that our workplaces are a meritocracy, and that the fight for equality was over and won by my mother's generation. I was finally understanding this was not the reality, and I wanted to do something about it. As I continued to research women in the workplace, I discovered an entire vocabulary that put words to things I'd always felt but hadn't known how to articulate. For example, I learned about emotional labor, the contortionism that women, especially women of color, perform to fit into and accommodate environments where they are not the status quo. All of this was enlightening, but it was also overwhelming. With such systemic entrenched bias, what could I as an individual possibly do? A year later, I was approached by an art director friend of mine, Lita. She'd recently found out that a male art director friend of hers was charging almost double what she was. This discovery made Lita realize how little she knew about pricing and how important it was for this to be a larger, more open conversation with our peers. She was also concerned that the lack of transparency might mean other people were underpricing themselves, which in turn could be bringing down wages for everyone. Because I was the director of marketing for a platform that helped people find work, I was in a position to bring information and awareness to a large network of people. Lita wondered if there was something I could do to help women learn what they should be paid. It began to dawn on me that in so many ways, money symbolized much of what I'd been agonizing over in the past year. Money and having the same opportunities to earn just as much as men was about much more than a number. It represented value, worth, and above all, power. All things that as women, we have historically been denied. This conversation with Lita happened during the lead up to the 2016 presidential election. As I thought about organizing an event for women to talk about money, I became intrigued by the town halls the candidates were hosting, and I thought it could be a good alternative in lieu of the format of a typical panel. I envisioned one made up of women of different backgrounds and professions, trading stories and advice about money in an open forum, essentially democratizing a subject that had always seemed to be in the domain of experts, men. More important, it could finally get us talking about a topic that was taboo, that was considered crass, but that men seemed able to navigate with ease. Maybe if one of us spoke up, others would follow. All we needed was a bit of encouragement. To get people to sign up, I asked 6 women I admired if they would be open to sharing their money stories. I also asked each of them to recommend a few women they thought should be there. For each woman I was introduced to, I asked if they could recommend another woman who might want to attend. This went on until we reached capacity. The day of the event, 100 women came. They crowded together on couches, spilling out onto the floor, passing around bottles of wine and tequila, buzzing with energy. It reminded me of the ladies' room at the advertising festival. It was my first public speaking experience, and I knew I didn't have all the answers. I was there to learn just as much as they were. I told the room that we would get out of the event only as much as we were willing to give. To receive help meant we had to offer it. We raised our glasses to one another and we began. It was like a cork shooting out of a champagne bottle. One story begat another as these women opened up to one another and to themselves. They shared stories of disappointments and struggles, missed opportunities, denied promotions. There were lots of tears, but lots of high fives too. One woman stood up and declared, "I'm an illustrator and I make a shit ton of money." She got a standing ovation. I was right. This conversation was about so much more than the dollars in our pockets. It was about solidarity. It was about self-worth. It was also about taking action to right the wrongs that we'd been laboring under. We could no longer wait and hope to be rewarded. Money was the first step, a tangible thing that could mark progress on what was sure to be a long road ahead. I'm almost done. To close the wage gap, we could start with ourselves by advocating for our worth. But for all of us to rise, we needed to work together. 3 hours later, the event was technically over, but no one was leaving. I was becoming antsy since the venue was charging me by the hour. "Go home," I shouted as I turned off the lights. Everyone reluctantly shuffled out, and I could hear them discussing what bar to go to. They didn't want the conversation to end. As one of the women walked out, she pulled me aside. "This," she said, motioning around the room. "You should do this." I didn't know what she meant, but something magical had happened that night. On my way home, I felt electric. That energy in the room was coursing through my veins, and my mind was racing. It had been over a year since I'd Googled workplace inequality, and I thought that maybe, just maybe, this could be the start of something big, something that could lead toward making things right. While I didn't quite know what was next, perhaps the first step was simply for us to share our stories as we had done that night. So I created the Slack group that night. Over the course of the next 12 months, I organized 250 town halls in 19 cities, bringing together thousands of women to talk about money, power, work, and self-worth. And every time a woman got up to speak, she discovered she was not alone. As I watched them, I knew there had to be a way to harness the strength we have when we come together. I wanted to see it move beyond those rooms and those town halls, to build an even larger collective that could allow us to learn from one another, encourage one another, and share practical advice and professional guidance to get us where we wanted to be. The town halls were our catharsis, but with no action afterward, all that inspiration and energy would be wasted, and nothing would change. While organizing these events, I witnessed the power in peer-to-peer sharing, but I also saw that there was a great need for concrete tools to fix actual problems. One topic that kept coming up in the town halls all across the country was insecurity surrounding salary negotiation. Teaching more women how to negotiate their salaries wasn't a big picture structural change, but it could at least start moving the needle in the short term. As I fit the pieces together, I knew there was something special happening, but what I didn't know was that a movement was being born. This one area of actionable change became the cornerstone of our movement and a springboard for accessing and improving broader issues impacting women in the workplace. As of this writing, the Ladies Get Paid community has grown to more than 100,000 women who are all working together to advance women in the workplace. In this book, I will share the stories of 9 members. Some names and identifying details have been changed. Each in their own way, these women battle internal and external struggles, pushing up against the bounds of what they and others expect of themselves, and are ultimately able to reach places of purpose, fulfillment, and power. For many of them, this meant undoing assumptions and rebuilding expectations, examining where they came from, and becoming clear on what direction they will go. In their stories, I will highlight what they can teach us. In those moments, I hope you will reflect on your own life and how you'll use these tools to rocket yourself forward. Now I'm almost done with the introduction. This book is organized into 4 parts. The first part explores the obstacles we may have at ourselves. We'll examine expectations we may have inherited from our families, the media, our communities, and other influences about what career success looks like and what we can achieve. From there, we'll learn to identify and evaluate opportunities to make sure we're headed on a path that's aligned with our values and goals. Then we'll break down imposter syndrome and perfectionism, 2 major internal roadblocks, often resulting from systemic and cultural obstacles that stand in our way of feeling and doing our best. In the second part of the book, we'll broaden our focus. You'll learn how to build and leverage your network to get you to where you want to go. This includes interviewing, securing, and negotiating for a new job. But getting the job is only the first step. You need to also set yourself up for success. That means educating yourself on how to develop healthy work habits for the long game. Things like conducting an inventory of your energy and setting boundaries for yourself and others so that you don't burn out. You can't do well if you aren't well. Then we'll explore how to navigate upward, cultivating a support system, increasing our visibility, and taking advantage of opportunities. The ultimate goal? To seek out rewarding challenges and do our best work in a place that recognizes and rewards us. At a certain point, however, trying to do well in a system that was not made by or for us is not good enough. The system itself has to change. The final part of the book is about what we can do to make our workplaces more inclusive and supportive of women, including policies and practices companies can implement to make that happen. But for true systemic change to happen, we need updated and evolved laws. The appendix includes information on how to lobby your elected officials to enact laws that ensure wide-ranging and long-lasting progress. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that some of the lessons in this book come from a place of relative privilege. Being able to walk away from a negotiation or turn down a job are luxuries. And while as women we are bound together by our marginalized status, my experience in the workplace as a white cisgender woman is not the same as that of a Black woman, or a Hispanic woman, or a woman with a disability, or a trans woman, or any of the countless women in groups pushed to the fringes of society who have been fighting these battles for generations. I firmly believe that we have progressed only as far as those who still struggle the most among us. If we're going to make meaningful change, it has to benefit all of us, not just some of us. And we have to do it together. Let's get started. Thank you all so very, very much that you stuck around. Thank you for that. And again, really want to encourage you to support a book passage who has my book. And I can't stress enough how important it is to independent bookstores are really having a hard time, guys, right now. So let me put that in the chat. I'm also going to let you all know about our next two events. The next one is tomorrow morning, my time in LA, 10 a.m., 1 p.m. Eastern time. It's a free event. I'm going to be talking about networking, answering any and all questions that you have around that. And the next book event is also very exciting. It is with Beth Comstock, who is the former vice chair of GE. And she's also the author of a book called Imagine It Forward. It's on February 2nd. And I would be honored if you came to that. All of this is free. So again, thank you to Comcast, NBC Universal for helping make that happen. Happy to stick around for a couple more minutes since I know I promised as part of the agenda to answer any questions that you have. But if not, I understand everyone has lives to go back to. So if you need to leave, thank you all. I'll stick around for just a minute or so. Of course, again, thank you to our amazing speaker, Soraya, and we'll send the recording and any information about all of us, the books and the organizations of Ladies Get Paid and the Representation Project. Ooh, what was your writing? Judy, yes, 3 talks today. This is my 3rd talk of the day, my last one. What was my writing process like? How does it feel to be published? The writing process was horrible, but it was so horrible because it was my first time, and so I sort of want to do it again just to give myself another chance. What I learned the most during my writing process is that the magic comes not from the writing, but from the editing. And so I had a Post-it note that I put on my computer that said, write like crap, because that to me was just get it out. That was the hardest part, just get it out. And then for me, there was a lot of structural stuff that needed to happen. So I laid things out on the floor, different themes, different stories. And I kind of did a whole like puzzle work of, should this go there? Maybe let's move it here. And this is why it took 2 years. Also, the most time that it took and the most intensive part of it was finding the right stories. So I was incredibly honored that I had women tell me such vulnerable things about their workplace experiences, because that's how the book is structured. 9 women, each of them is going through a different professional challenge, and then I give advice. So it also was their stories being synthesized with classes that I've taught and taking those transcripts, and it was weaving it together. So it was really, really hard, really, really painful, but ultimately really interesting, and I'm proud of how it came out. It feels weird to be published. I went into Barnes & Noble and I saw my book and I had no feeling. So that's being really honest. I've heard some other authors also experience it. This, also seeing my name in bold, it's a very, talk about vulnerable. I mean, I'm out there, and if people don't like the book, they're going to tell me. I mean, right now it's all good reviews, thank God, but I don't have any control over how people receive the book. So it's also very scary. So again, I'm really proud of myself, but it's been a process of like, I'm out there. The stories we met in my workshop, so they were either people who were referred to me, like I kind of sent the bat signal out to a group of my friends. I knew the challenges that I wanted to cover, so I did begin there. Surveys. So I sent out surveys in the newsletter, Ladies Get Paid newsletter. I put the surveys in Slack, and people wrote in, and I interviewed a number of those people, and ultimately went with, I mean, it was intense. And I had to say to some women, I love your story. I think I'm going to write about it, but I ultimately didn't use it. There were just certain things when I heard people's stories, it opened up my eyes to things that I could talk about further. So at first I was trying to like reverse engineer it. I knew what I wanted to say and I wanted to find the right story to back that part up. And then as I listened to more and more women, I realized, you know what? I'm going to let their story lead. So again, just, maybe I need to do another kind of book of like all the rest of the stories or something. Thank you for those 2 questions. I appreciate it. If there are no more questions, I'm going to go lie down now because it's been a day. I hope that I see you all tomorrow, 1 p.m. Eastern time. Again, office hours. It's going to be on YouTube. So if you can't make it, it's still there. But if you want to register and submit your questions, I will answer it. And if you haven't joined our Slack group yet, I know we talked about it a while. So ladiesgetpaid.com/join. We manually add every person to Slack. So you'll get the invite within the week that you signed up. Thank you. Thank you. If Soraya's still here, thank you so much to you and appreciate all of your time and generosity and much love. Stay well, all stay safe. And I think most importantly for all of us, stay sane. Be angry, but stay sane. There you go. See you all hopefully tomorrow.